Tara here, and I'm really interested in no's. I'm interested in negations. I'm interested in refusals. In a really difficult time for the planet, and indeed our families, it's often easier to say yes, but that yes can be flooded with resentment, fear, confusion, and loss. But there's also been an incredible interest post the pandemic, actually, on burnout and quiet quitting. There's an interesting literature on both. Both are a no, both are a refusal of a different kind. So this week, let's talk with Professor Priscilla Dunk-West and explore the nature of burnout, its context, its cause, and let's hope its solutions. Oh, Priscilla, I'm so thrilled to be back in touch with you. And look, we're doing one of our joyous conversations again in Goth Central. We're talking about burnout. And look, I'm a bit obsessed about the word burnout, and I'm also a bit obsessed about that phrase quiet quitting as well. And since the pandemic, the literature on both of these tropes has really exploded. Now, is that sort of a weird accidental correlation thing? Or do you think there is an historical post-COVID realignment in how we're thinking about life, work, burnout, and indeed capitalism and quiet quitting?
I think it's all of those things. I think it's an historically evolved situation that we find ourselves in. So you think back a generation ago or 2 generations ago where workplaces were somewhat stable, predictable. You sold your labour in particular ways. You stayed in the institution for longer. You know, I'm talking very generally.
Yeah.
But work was different in what we did and what our industries were pre-internet, pre-advance of communicative technologies.
Yeah.
And so you had a very stable conceptualization of what work is.
Wow.
Right? And so now there's a kind of more fragmented sense of work, probably from the pandemic in terms of our private life, our home life, work as vocation, work as drawing on the individual self. But then you've also got the kind of ingredients that sit around individualisation. And so you see the self as the product that you're selling, for example. So there's a whole, they're just 2 sort of little drivers, if you like. And then there's a whole lot of other social conditions that sit around that. And so we've got increased awareness through individualisation about ourselves, and we have our gaze turning inwards. And so I guess there is more of a recognition that workplaces might not suit the person that we are. They might not be places that are suitable for us to engage in. And so I think that then has people thinking about what they do want to do and more reflexive about how they want their labour to be, manifested in either institutions, or maybe they want it to be something that generates income to produce freedom. Wow. So maybe they want to work in concentrated ways so that they have time off. And young people, I'm always going on about young people, but I just think they've, the side hustles that young people talk about. Look at me with all the lingo. But that idea that work is a means to an end, and it's a kind of it's not who you are, but it might be. But that's up to you to sort of work through. So I do think that individualisation has a real hold on the way that we look at work now.
Look, I've learnt more from what you've said there. Isn't it stunning that the sociology of work, that when I was a lass, that was a very, very big area. So Stan the Man Arnowitz, respect, even Henry Giroux was working in the notion of the sociology of work, and we've lost that. What's amazing is you focus on that individualisation, the selling of labour power, Marx 101, but what's amazing is I'm sort of I've always argued that there's quoting Henry David Thoreau, there's a quiet desperation there as well, which you haven't found yet. But maybe that's my next question. If we can focus it on academic work. Academic work is a very odd beast because it can and often does occupy every single minute of our lives, and there's never really been a connection, Marx 101, between the time that we spend and the money that we earn. We just sort of do it. It's that priestly vocation stuff. But it gets really complicated with the huge adjunct workforce. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, a lot of my mates are working in this casual work environment, and they're getting paid a certain figure, not a very high figure, to mark a paper every 8 minutes. So you mark a paper in 8 minutes, and that's how you're paid. Have you got any strategies, and you must do because you're this wise woman and I'm an epic #epic fail, but have you got any strategies to stop academic life colonising every single minute?
I don't have a magic answer. I guess thinking about, it's the example that you gave is an example of how the work gets portioned up. And unfortunately, unlike lots of other workplaces, academic work, when it's part-time, is very difficult to do. And it's often people with caring responsibilities. It's often women who have to or want to do academic work part-time. And I think academic work, it's teaching, it's scholarly work, it's research, it's administrative roles, and so that spread isn't easily parcelled off. So that example of marking is easily parcelled off. So you can imagine if you've got a PhD and you want to get some work and you don't have a full-time gig, you're going to take those part-time, opportunities. And I guess, if you are in that situation, then taking those part-time opportunities, but seeing them as little pieces of the puzzle for your CV, giving you experience to open you up to full-time academic work, if that's what you want, is probably a way to approach it. But it is a very tricky space, and I don't think academia has been fast to catch up with the different ways of working. I don't think it's necessarily a great vocation to be a part-time worker in. It's really hard. The amount of academics I've talked to over the years who have said, I'm part-time, but in reality I work across the week, across the weekend, work doesn't stop, that sort of idea. And you've probably heard the same, right? It bleeds into everything. It bleeds into everything.
And look, I remember about 15 years ago, one of the universities I was at, some inverted commas manager, not a leader, an inverted commas manager, decided to do a time and motion study. So we had to fill in timesheets of our working environment. And we did that for 1 month and then submitted those timesheets. And needless to say, no one ever contacted us again, Priscilla, mate. No one ever contacted us again to offer any feedback or...
Oh, I'd love to see that data. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, well, I would have too. But what's interesting is that the inverted commas study magically disappeared. Which demonstrates it was above and beyond what a sort of corporate managerial configuration, if someone, as I did this morning, wake up at 1:50 in the morning because I'm recording an audio book and that's the only really, really quiet time I can do that. Starting a timesheet at 1:52 probably is not enlivening for a work-life balance, I'd imagine. Which, of course, I want to touch on my next question, which you've already discussed, which is the instability for our colleagues. And every day, universities around the world, but I'm conscious there's a list in the United Kingdom of every staff member that's being sacked. And every day, a university in the UK is removing staff or entire disciplines. So what does that instability do? How does it change academics' relationship with work, paid or unpaid? So when we add that sort of virus of instability, what happens?
It opens up a big gaping hole in education, I think, because what you get is a kind of retreating of the institution from particular disciplines. And in Australia, I think, in some ways, what takes up those spaces are private educational providers, perhaps. And so you get this. So in Australia, we have a lot of private educational institutions and we have public educational institutions, and so it's an interesting landscape if you look at it in that way. And then look at how, do the privates, are you able to do research in the privates? Yes, increasingly lots of them are. So, how do those institutions look different? But just going back to what I said about the generational shift in work, universities have been very slow. Like, this happened in other sectors a long time ago, and I think we're just catching up, to be honest. I think we are just catching up. But I do lament the increasing, profit profit lens that we put on our public institutions. I'm a big fan of free education, opening up access to people. Yeah. And I think institutions should be reflections of broader society. They should have people working in them with that, with diversity. Right. And unfortunately, what happens is when institutions can't cater for diversity, you lose that workforce. And so that's that quiet quitting, right? Big chunks of people. Yeah. So people, women going through menopause, there was a recent Senate report that looked at the impact on the workforce. They just leave. They leave institutions, and so we lose them. So, wow. Yes, it's pretty bleak. Yeah.
Look, it is, and I didn't mean to drag you down to Gothland.
I'm in that hole.
You and I tend to live in that hole, but managing, I think, knowing that it's unstable. That's the only thing I'd say is through my lifetime, assuming that, tenure and there would be a happy ever after, I think lied to people. And if we can try and convince our younger crew to not live or invest in the lie, and take the lens off about, this is a priestly vocation and so forth, just click that out and see it as the pretty tough capitalism, 8-minute increments to do papers, and see that as real, and then make decisions from there.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing that you can do in the face of this, and I think doing that means that you are more likely to stay true to yourself. Boom. And to recognise that the rules of the game change, right? So, at one stage it was, you had to write lots and lots of papers, or you had to write, in Q1 journals, or you had to, those sorts of rules. If you're looking at the institution as in that precarity kind of lens, then you've got to understand that the rules change as well. And so staying true to what you love doing, what, sets your world alight in, a beautiful kind of way, I think is going to kind of have you sailing through all of that uncertainty.
Yeah, you've got to be real and you've got to be authentic. You've got to find the authenticity in the chaos, I think.
Yes.
And that leads to my last question for all our dear friends who from around the world, my goodness me, who have been listening to these podcasts. And I love listening to Priscilla. I learn so much. But for colleagues who are listening to us, and I've got a lot of my friends at the moment that are picketing outside of particular universities in the United Kingdom at the moment. So hello to the team in Bournemouth. But if colleagues are listening to us and feeling burnt out, or they're feeling tired, or they're feeling exhausted, or they're feeling unmotivated, or indeed they're feeling frightened, can we just offer a couple of strategies to help with that reframing and that reorganisation for them?
I think take the focus off yourself as impaired, right? So in burnout literature, it was in social work at least, the idea of burnout was about the impaired worker, that there was something wrong with you because you were burnt out, and the symptoms were that you felt depressed, or you were cynical, or those symptoms are actually symptoms that have come from an institution. So take that gaze, like there's nothing wrong with you. The problem is the institution. And so I think that strategy of making sense of what's happening really takes it from that deficit lens and says, imagine if you were in an institution that cared for you in particular ways, that nurtured what you wanted to do. What would that look like? And then how would you feel in that, and really think about the institution. So I think, and yes, collectivism, actions that seek to change the institutions, I think is really powerful. And then just staying true to yourself and true to what what you're interested in. I think I still work in a university. I love being an academic.
Yep.
There are places that that will fit who you are, and I think finding them is a task, but it can be done.
And find your friends too. Find your friends.
Yes.
I mean, again, you've been such a delight. Meeting you has just been opened, for an old goth's heart. You've just opened the old goth's heart up. But also, I should say, your point's a great one. And again, to go back to the sociology of work literature, the legendary David Chandler got into those debates about resilience. Like an individual, you just need to be resilient, mate. You just need to be resilient. And he went, no. The time has come to move it from individual resilience to organisational resilience.
Yes.
And his intervention in thinking about robust and porous and compassionate infrastructures, I think is transformative for us all.
Absolutely. And let's make better institutions. Let's all just make the ones we want to work in. The amount of people I've spoken to over the years who have said, let's just start our own university. And, I think maybe that's the answer. People begin to create new spaces to be themselves in.
What a glorious space to end. So to all our friends around the world, thank you for listening to us. And we wish you well. We wish you a good day. We wish you a good night. And we wish you peace. So Priscilla, as always, thank you for being legendary.
Thank you.